Hi, this is Paul. It's been a while. Sorry for my sudden absence. Many of you might have read the note or got word that last 2 weeks ago, Wednesday, I got a call from my mother that my younger sister she was watching TV, watching the news with her husband after work, and he saw that she had slumped over in the chair, and he noticed that she was gasping. And so he went right over to her, and she was unresponsive. He called 911. Paramedics came. They worked on her for quite a while in the driveway. They were unable to resuscitate her. They took her to the hospital. They were unable to resuscitate her there either, and she passed away likely almost immediately right there in the chair in her home with my brother-in-law. And there's always confusion when you get these kinds of phone calls at first. My father, 5 years ago, had passed away in a similar manner. He was 77, but my younger sister, she's the one in the little the white blouse and red plaid skirt here in this picture, taken of us when we were children. She was 53, and her death was a surprise and a shock to all of us. And she lives on the East Coast, so once I got news, I immediately jumped on, got a flight, and the next day flew out. And I've been on the East Coast since and just came back to Sacramento yesterday evening. And coming back is getting back. This is a holiday weekend in the United States with Thanksgiving Day approaching. There's work things that need doing. There's family things that need doing. The family out east continues, obviously, with a death like this. Continues to be a major disruption. And so we're all grieving, and we're all trying to get into the new normal and support my brother-in-law and my mother and my nephew and nieces. She had 3 children with my brother-in-law. So it's a big deal. And that's the reason I've been gone for a while and haven't been making videos, quite obviously. But as I've been dealing with my own grief and working through this stuff, the kinds of things that I talk about in my channel continue to roll through my head. And I've been thinking about mapping. I remember when I first saw maps of meaning, I thought, why maps? And so I've been thinking a lot about maps and thinking about how Jung attempted to map the unconscious and how Jordan Peterson maps meaning and psychology. And so with all the learning I've been doing over the last year, I've been doing a lot of thinking on these subjects. So before I dive into that, I first want to thank you for your thoughts and prayers. Many of you have sent me emails or messages in the comments section on Twitter, on Facebook, and I deeply appreciate all those expressions. Jonathan Peugeot sent me a note, and he told Jordan Peterson about my sister's passing. And in the midst of his crazy schedule, he also sent me a couple of emails, and that was deeply appreciated for him to take time out of his schedule. So it might take a little bit of time for me to return to normal programming. I use this to process. I'll probably be doing a rough draft for Sunday this coming Friday after the holiday this Thursday. But bit by bit, I'll get back into it. I'll probably be taking another trip out east. My mother and my brother-in-law can use my support. And obviously that lends to a disruption here on the church side. And we'll be figuring those things out as we move forward. And sorry for all the people that got bumped in terms of conversations. I had a whole slew of conversations planned, and most of them got canceled. And in time, we can reschedule. And at some point, I intend to return things back to normal. In fact, I've got some new ideas for Patreon, some online meetup ideas, and some ideas for some more formal theological classes that I'm going to give. And so in a time like this, you tend to have time to think and time to ponder. And so I've been pondering this channel, and so I have some new ideas that I hope to be able to roll out. One of the things that I was pondering is, why does a close death bother us so much? And these botherings are deep. In fact, this kind of grief people die from sometimes. That's a strange thing if we imagine that we're just these material animals. And if you watch, I remember watching Jane Goodall, watching chimps grieve for the loss of their loved ones. But for us as human beings, what exactly is the nature of our ties to one another? It's obvious that it does, but it isn't obvious why it does. What is the nature of the connections? Take off this silly thing. What is the nature of the connections between us? How do our mappings impact grief? The motivation to share condolences, the shape of these words. I've been thinking a lot about that. My sister was a Christian school teacher, and she left classes of middle school children. She was an English teacher. She left classes of middle school children in the lurch, and some of these sixth graders came through the receiving line at visiting hours. We'd probably had over 600 people show up at visiting hours. My sister deeply impacted many, many lives, had over 700 people at her service, and at some point once the service was videotaped, and I did have a part in that, and so I'll post links at least, or maybe more to some of those things as they become available. But these little sixth graders who are just starting Mrs. Johnson's class, and now to have their teacher die, and to go past the casket and see what sort of looks like their teacher there in the casket, and for them to ponder and then meet us strangers. My heart really went out to those little sixth graders that are just kind of reeling from this. And she was a tremendously popular teacher in her school. Many people came through the line and said that they themselves had her. I'm going to pause for a minute, get a drink. Some people who came through the line had her when they were going to that particular school, and then their children had her. And she was a tremendously popular teacher. She touched a lot of students, and many people came through the line and shared those stories with us, and it left quite an impression. And as someone who's grieving a sister who didn't know that side of her life as much as I knew other sides of her life, it was a tremendous comfort, and it was a beautiful thing. While I was my wife took a picture of me in my mother's basement, because I laughed. Sometimes my wife and I talk about some of the buccos as basement dwellers living in their mother's basement, and here I was living in my mother's basement. But I started rereading C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, and one of the things that Douglas Gresham, that's C.S. Lewis's stepson, wrote in the introduction to A Grief Observed was the note of, as always, C.S. Lewis was amazingly careful with his language, a grief observed. All of these griefs are different. And my mother, my father passed away about 5 years ago, but this is a different kind of grief for my mother than losing a husband who was 77 years old. This is a different kind of grief when my aunt passed away last year, my aunt that my mother was close to. This is a different kind of grief for me, grieving a younger sister rather than my father. I'm familiar with grief, being a pastor, walking with people through grief in church. We had a grief share class. Ran through it a couple of times at our church, and I led it once. And there's a lot that you can learn about grief, but every grief is different, and it's different because our mappings with these other people are different. My relationship with my father is not the relationship with my sister, and all the differences are manifest in this complex experience of grief. Tim Keller notes in his, what I think was probably my favorite book of his, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, notes that people have very different experiences of what they find comforting. Some people just want to be sat with in silence. Some people want to hear religious ideas and religious sentiments rehearsed, and they find those things comforting. Other people find talk of God or the afterlife or heaven or a better place or something like that offensive when they're in an angry, painful place in grief. And it was helpful in Tim Keller's book where he noted that as a pastor he's found that people grieve differently and they find different things comforting while they're grieving. Some people don't want to see any pictures of the deceased, while others wish to surround themselves with pictures of the deceased. My brother-in-law with his children began watching some videos of when their children were young and small, and they found that comforting. Others would find that to be too much. And it's very idiosyncratic and individual what people find comforting. And so often as a pastor, I'll encourage people to, be free with it and explore. And if you find something comforting, okay. But if someone is trying to comfort you in another way that you're not finding comforting, if you have the ability, be a little gracious towards them, because in many cases people are well-meaning. We've developed in our culture a license to be offended and suffering often, and we might want to yell to someone, "You're trying to comfort me wrong." And in fact, that's a long old story, because the most famous comforters in the Bible were Job's friends, and Job called them miserable comforters. And in fact, at the end of the book of Job, God was quite unhappy with those comforters. So comforters ought to take a bit of care and be a little sensitive. But those who are grieving, if they have the capacity, it's helpful to also be generous towards those who really do want to express their condolences. One of the things that I ponder when I watch this dynamic are the mirror neurons, and psychologists will talk about how when we see pain, we feel pain, and that's a powerful motivational structure. And in fact, in the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations, those mirror neurons are highly powerful in terms of motivation. And I often find that when people see someone in pain, because we are also experiencing pain, then we want to pull back and we want to push away. And so there's a lot of that dynamic going on. Suffering is contagious. And so often what people do when they come to bring comfort to the grieving is that they speak what is comfortable to themselves. And again, this is part of the idiosyncratic nature of grieving. And so again, when people come up and they have to share what they have to share, it's probably the ideas that most comfort them when they're experiencing and being confronted with the pain that they see in the eyes of the bereaved. And to me, simple is good. Oftentimes people come through the line and they simply say, "My condolences." And I personally find that to be very appropriate, because as with this death, there's little that can be said. It was such a surprise. It was such a shock. And by the nature of it, people want to, again, the mirror neuron thing often prompts people to try to find reasons for it, or holy reasons for it, like God wanted this, or God is doing that, and God needs this. And in my experience, those can be rather hazardous things to share, because if you've lost a loved one, you're not looking out for what God is wanting, because pain in a sense makes us selfish. It pulls us in and it occupies us, and we're just looking for comfort. And so often just a simple expression of "My condolences, I'm praying for you, my thoughts are with you," I find to be just the simplest way for one person to say to the other, I see your pain and I'm sorry for you. And of course, I don't share the depths of the pain that you experience, but you are not alone in your pain. I am with you in it, even for just this moment or to this small degree. And I personally find that to be comforting, and I deeply appreciate those who do so. It shares the heart of it, that you are not alone in your suffering, especially a suffering that can't be blunted. But now this brings into ourselves the maps, because we commonly point to a blessed afterlife, which is part of our religious mapping. It's part of our cultural mapping. It's part of our social mapping. And obviously for many atheists who don't believe in an afterlife, it gets more difficult because, well, you could say at least they're in no pain, because if you're an atheist, then there is no pain. It's the nothingness you experienced before life that now you experience after. There is no experience. It's not even no experience. It's just null value. So what happens often when we're processing our own grief, and when we're trying to console others in grief, is that we're actually expressing our internal maps, our religious, theological, social, culture maps. It often surprises people when I tell them that as a pastor, I don't really know how to phrase this, but I find funerals often to be more productive and meaningful than weddings. Now, weddings are more joyful in a sense, because here is a young couple in love, and we're all gathered here to celebrate their love and to wish them well, and that's a wonderful thing. But funerals, as a pastor, are tremendously productive, because we play all kinds of mental games with our mapping, but when we're faced with death, suddenly we have to get very serious about what we believe and what we think is true and what we hope for. And it's been my experience that often when we're facing death, when we're looking into that coffin, when we're confronted with that grave, that now we can cut through a bunch of the facades and games that we play, that we can talk seriously and honestly about what we believe, about our doubts. So I find grief and this space to be productive. It's a hard space. It's a painful space, but it's a productive space. And for me, this gets into something that I've said along the way in my processing of Peterson, that we'll exchange suffering for meaning. Meaning is that valuable to us and that important that now when we grieve, we're ready to do some work. And so our maps, our religious maps, our spiritual maps, our social maps, our cultural maps, they then shape our words. And part of it is wrote, my condolences to you in your loss. I'm sorry for your loss. These things shape our words, and so we have these liturgies that we rehearse and speak to one another. But it's also part assertion and hope. And so when sometimes, again, because of the mirror neurons, people will want to jump past the pain. When they see the pain in my eyes or the eyes of the bereaved, that we don't want to feel pain, and so well they're in heaven and they're not suffering, and when we do that, it's in a sense pushing back the pain of the other and shortcutting it. And so I'll often advise people not to shortcut the pain if they can tolerate it, because again, the pain tends to focus us and sharpen us. The difficulty with pain is that it also makes us selfish and also makes us desperate. And sometimes the pain overwhelms us, which is again why it is good to be around others who are feeling the same grief, so that when one is overwhelmed by the pain, the other can be there with them in pain. One of the things that the then chaplain of Calvin College, Dale Cooper, when I was going there, used to repeat in many of his sermons, and I probably remember it because he repeated it in his sermons, that Joy shared is joy multiplied, but pain shared is pain divided. And so when we're in pain, it is helpful to share that pain, because the pain is then divided and we are not alone in our pain. And again, we know this to be true. Why it is true is far harder to know, but we know that it is true. But pain is isolating and in some ways can be self-indulgent. It is a wound that demands to be nursed. My thoughts also go to consciousness and suffering, because the grief is, as I've said many times, our conscious mind is just this one small element of our overall minds, and consciousness is like this cloud, that the space that the elements of the world enter into and recede out of, and the consciousness is the place where all of the various layers of our mapping come to the fore. And so with grief, immediately, obviously, when the first shock comes, the pain overwhelms and consciousness fills or is flooded with that pain. But parts of our mind continue to grieve even while, our body is smart. I was watching, we grieve differently at different ages. Children who are young, again, those little sixth graders came through the line and, almost in shock. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. They stand back. And so then loving adults come around them and begin to train them in the words of grief. And even though I was grieving the loss of my sister, seeing those children come through, compassion welled up, and we go from, there's kind of a switch that goes, and now even in the midst of my pain, I'm motivated to bring consolation to that child who is grieving, or when I see my mother or my sister or my brother-in-law or my nephew or nieces or my children, when the grief floods in, we come together and we embrace and we cry together and we hug. And it's hard to know how to talk about that particular moment of pain and pleasure all mixed together, but there's a solidarity, and there's even, in some moments, can be a joy. But there's meaning and there's purpose and there's truth in those moments. Sometimes grief hides out of sight from the consciousness cloud, and you'll be going through the day and there'll be a picture of Lori, and or something will come up and the pang, or a song will come up and it'll open me emotionally, and I'll take a few minutes to do that grieving work and maybe shed a tear. Or maybe some anger will come up, and I'll talk about anger in a moment. Maybe some anger will come up, and I'll process that. And so we walk through this together. My wife mentioned she thought in some ways that my family grieved well, and I'm sure in some ways we grieve well, and in other ways we don't grieve well. There's no perfect way to do this, and no one does it perfectly, but part of what we've tended to do in our family is we share pictures and we share stories, and we continue to talk about the lost loved one, and we share stories, and we laugh and we joke, and then we cry. And for me as a pastor, I've seen that in so many funerals where there's laughter and there's sorrow, and those two things are close together, and we switch, we go back from one to the other when we can. And then a lot of it's dependent on the type of humor. I tend to have gallows humor, and so right away when Lori died, many thoughts, she cut the line, Lori was naughty. And when I saw my parents, and I saw my mother and my sister, I told my sister, I said, now don't you be rude. It was terribly rude of my father and my sister to just die instantly of heart attacks with, no warning, none of us knowing, no chance to say goodbye. Often as a pastor, I'll walk with families who are loved ones dying of cancer or old age or systems shutting down or congestive heart failure. And there's time to gather family and friends to say last goodbyes, to maybe heal some old wounds and old divisions. But the way my father and my sister went, there was no time. They were simply gone. And so I told my sister that was awfully rude of them to leave this way, to, in both cases, both of them died out east. So I hop on a plane the next day and never had a chance to. I see that the pain comes and goes, never had a chance to say goodbye. And so I say goodbye to the body in the casket at the visiting hours. I will at some point link my eulogy to my sister. I'll link the written, what I brought up into the pulpit, and I'll link that. I put it on my blog along with her obituary. But again, this gets deeply into our maps, and so because I'm a Christian and because I believe in the resurrection, and that is not the same in belief in terms of her being with the Lord now, as the Bible says. It's not the same. We don't know how we'll be reunited with one another, but I believe in the resurrection, and I believe that I will not only see Jesus, but I will see my sister, and I will see my father, and I will see my grandparents, and I will see many of the saints of living stones, and I will see them with my eyes, and we will be together in bodily form. And that thought brings me a great deal of comfort at times when I'm feeling the loss. But often grief hides outside the conscious cloud, and it interrupts and disturbs unexpectedly, and that can surprise us, and we find ourselves embarrassed, even though, in my experience, people often aren't. There's no shame in it. People understand when you're grieving. Most people do. Few people will mock. But perhaps we're embarrassed because we've now exposed something of ourselves. And if you're high in openness like me and you're announcing it to YouTube, maybe that's not such a big concern. But that's common. We find ourselves embarrassed when we're brought to tears and when we're feeling the pain, or maybe when we're expressing anger, and that's the last thing. And so I'll post my eulogy to my sister in written form. It's already up on my blog. Anger is natural. Don't suppress it or indulge it. Integrate it. Work it through. In the eulogy, right after my sister died, I got the news from my mother, and I was packing to get an early flight the next day. I was already processing John 11, which is what I treated in the eulogy. When Jesus comes before the grave of his friend Lazarus, knowing full well, in fact, intentionally delaying his coming to his friends. And he's angry. And you say, well, what are you angry with? Are you angry with the Father? Doesn't seem to be angry with the Father. He's angry at death. Well, what kind of thing is death? Well, death in the Bible is often personified. He's angry at death, and he's angry at loss, and he's angry at what death does in this world. And he's also weeping. And in fact, Jesus in John 11 fully integrates all of it. There's the very famous 5 stages of grief, and you'll learn very quickly that they're not sequential. They're all mixed together. And C.S. Lewis deals with this in A Grief Observed, and he deals with his anger and his pain and all of the various things that it brings into him. This is how we are. We ought not to be embarrassed by it. We ought not to feel guilty about it. It's just how we are. Anger is natural. Don't suppress it nor indulge it. Integrate it. People often want to push it away because of the mirror neuron thing. If we're disturbed by seeing a sorrowful person, we're highly disturbed by seeing an angry person, because angry people are dangerous. They'll say angry things, or they'll do angry things, or they'll destroy things. And so we're naturally reluctant. And so often people will after the eulogy I gave, where I did express anger, and I wanted the community that was experiencing the loss of my sister to be able to process its anger, and I needed to process my anger, because we have a right to be angry. My sister ought not to be dead. Those sixth graders ought not to have to stand in line. My nephew and my nieces and my brother-in-law ought not to be missing their wife and their mother. My mother ought not to bury her daughter. I ought not to bury my sister. Anger is appropriate. Express it. But integrate it. Feel it. Know it. Don't be afraid of it. It's not an unchristian thing. If Jesus could be angry at the tomb of Lazarus, we can be angry at the tomb of our loved ones. But process it. Don't let it possess you. And in terms of angry at God, people get angry at God all the time. The good parent can manage the appropriate anger of their beloved child. To be a parent is to be a good parent is to have your children angry with you from time to time. The good parent understands anger. The anger might not be justified. The anger might be justified. But it's an emotion. Let it be an emotion. Don't let it be a master. Don't let it become a house to dwell in. I think that's the last slide. So I just wanted to do a short video on grief and loss, on where I've been at, on why I haven't been doing any videos. I'll get back to rambling about Jordan Peterson and doing the things I do soon enough. Again, I've got some ideas. I want to do some virtual meetups. I've continued to get requests, and I can't fly around the country and host meetups all the time. So I'm thinking about doing something as a thank you for Patreons, and then I'm also thinking about, I've been teaching a Sierra Leadership Network thing for a number of years where I do theological and biblical education, and so I might do a course in that and figure out how that goes. Again, that'll probably be a Patreon thing, because one way or another I have to figure out this crazy career of mine and justify the amount of time that I'm spending on this. And so more news on that as it comes out. But just, again, a sincere thank you for the expressions of condolences and sympathy that so many of you have expressed. And thank you for your patience. Sorry for the gap in the programming. I am myself, and I'll continue to be myself even as I walk through this grief thing, and probably do some videos about what I'm thinking about in terms of mapping and grief as well.